Hi guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial on creating an ASP.NET Core application with Angular 7. In the last video tutorial, we created the SendGrid email sender service that we are going to use, basically a class that we are going to use in order to write the logic to send emails to our users who are going to register in the application. We also created two classes here. One of them was for the properties that we will require to send emails to our users, and the second class was for the responses of the email. We also have another class in the services that is the auth message sender options, which contains the SendGrid property, SendGrid key, and the SendGrid user options or the values of these properties that can be accessed from our AppSettings.json file. If you have not watched the previous video tutorial how we set up a SendGrid account, please go ahead and watch that video tutorial before you start watching this video tutorial. Now let's go back to our SendGrid email sender class and let's start coding this class. So the first thing that we want to do when we are working on this SendGrid email sender service class is we want to get the values of our SendGrid username and the SendGrid API key, which is currently stored inside the AppSettings.json file. We have a key called as SendGrid. So when I say key, I'm not referring to this API key, I'm referring to this key value pair here. So we have two keys, which is SendGrid user and SendGrid key. And the value for SendGrid user is my username for the SendGrid account. And the SendGrid key value is the API value key. That is the API value that was provided to me by SendGrid to access or to use SendGrid services. So make sure you use your own key once again as explained in the last video tutorial. This key will be deleted as soon as I upload this video tutorial. So if you are downloading my source code and trying to use the same key, you will obviously get an error and the email would not be sent. So going back to the SendGrid email sender class, first thing that we want to do is get those keys. And to get those keys, as we all know, we have to use our helper class. And inside the helper class, we have the AppSettings.cs class. And now let's go ahead and add these two properties. Since we are not going to directly access these two properties from AppSettings.json file, we will use our helper class to access the properties as we did in the JWT token video tutorial. And if you have not watched that video tutorial, I recommend you to go and watch it because I have clearly explained why we are using this helper class to access the values from appsettings.json file, because it is recommended by Microsoft to use these classes. So I have added these two properties for our SendGrid username and user API key. So create these two properties and then you can save this AppSettings class. Go back to your SendGrid email server class, email sender class, and then here let's create a property that we can use and then instantiate it in our constructor. So let's create this property private read only, so it's accessible just in this class. Read only app settings. So we'll create an object of the app settings type of a data type. So app settings is our class which needs to be imported in this class. So let's add the missing reference and let's call this as underscore app settings. Is the same procedure that we are following that we used in the JWT token accessing in our account controller class. Now, as you all know the drill, we need to create an or instantiate this object, but we cannot access the values directly. Therefore, we are going to use an interface to accessing that options. So let's use the interface option type options, and what we want to access is the app setting property, and let's call this as app settings. Now we have to import to use interface options, we have to import the extensions.options from Microsoft. So let's do that. And now using this interface, we will be able to access all the values of the app settings class, all the property values. Now let's assign the value of underscore app settings to app settings. So app settings. Now this is going to give us an error, as we all know that we want to access the value using the interface. So that's what we want to do, is call the value property. Now we can access the value of the properties. Now next thing that we want to do here is we want to create a method that we are going to use to send this email to this user. So a function that we're going to use. Now let's go back to our SendGrid email account or SendGrid account. And as we saw in the last video tutorial, if we are using C#, we have the code that we have to use or refer when we are implementing it in our project. So we are going to use the same properties, but all we are going to change is the method name. And as we see here, this method is an asynchronous method. So let's go ahead and create an asynchronous method. Go back to application and let's call this as, using public because it needs to be accessed from other classes. So it cannot be private. Async a task. Let's add the reference. And here, what do we want to send a response, correct? So we are going to use the data type of our class send email response, because we are going to know if the response is either successful or if it's an error. That's the two properties that we have inside the send email response class that we have. So if you go back to email, send email response, we have two properties here. So now let's add the missing reference, and not we are going to call this method as send email async. Inside this method, we want to first copy. We can either copy this whole properties here because we're not going to change their names, these objects or these variables. So we will use the same naming convention as recommended by SendGrid. So let's do that. So now I have copied the same code from here, but I've just changed the values. So you'll see the variable names are the same, but I have changed the values. And I'm getting this error because there's one important thing that we have to do. In order to use these classes, we have to import the package for SendGrid. So let's go ahead. We cannot import it yet because we have not yet installed the package. So to install the package, we have to use NuGet package manager. So right click and let's add NuGet packages, and then let's search for SendGrid. So that's the package that we are going to use. It has almost 5 million downloads. So let's go ahead and download this, add the package. So it's adding, as you can see here, it's adding the SendGrid package. Once it is added, we can then add the reference to this package, and then we will not have any errors related to these classes that we are using. So now we have successfully added SendGrid. So let's import it. Using SendGrid. So, and then we also need to import SendGrid helpers.email. So mail. So sorry, let's do that. Now these errors have now disappeared. Now inside the method, what we want to do is when we are sending the email, we would need to provide the email of the user that we are sending the email to. Second, we need to also provide a subject for our email. And finally, we also need to provide a message that we are going to print or add in the body of the email. So let's create these three properties and add them as parameters of this send email async method. So whenever we are sending an email, whenever we are calling this method, we would need to always specify these three properties in the parameters of this method. So these three properties have been added. These all will be of type string. So the user email, the email subject, and the message. So these values will be provided when this method is being called. Now the errors have disappeared. We are getting this error because we need to return a value of type send email response. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are going to return new send email response, and now our send email async method is complete. So let's go ahead and look at this method and how it works. So the values will be supplied in the parameters, then the values will be assigned to all the objects here that we have created, these variables, and then we will use the SendGrid client class to create a new client. We would need a client to send the message. Using this client, we can then send this message and receive a response. So we will use the SendGrid client. So usually if you do remember that when we are calling any API, we will use the HTTP client. So we need a client to communicate with our users. So in this case, for our SMTP server from SendGrid, we will use the SendGrid client, which will help us to communicate. Then for the email address, we will use the email address class and create a new email address object, and then provide the email address of the person who is sending the email. In this case, it is me who's sending the email to my application users. So I have used my email address and I have supplied a name here. So this is nothing but my username and my email address. So you can change this to your email and your username. So make sure these two are not same, correct? So you're not sending the email to yourself when you're sending it to a user. So when you're testing it, use some other email to test. So I mean, when you're sending an email to any client, make sure that that client email is not the same as the sender's email. So next thing that we want to do is look at this subject, which is the email subject, and this will be provided by the class that is calling this method. And the to email address, again, once again, we will create a new email address object and then provide the to email address, which will be provided in the parameters of the method, and the usernames I've left it as test. So in this case, I'm going to assign whatever the message is, whether it's an HTML type message or it's a plain text message. The content will come from this value, which is message, string message. That will be assigned to these two variables here. And then using the mail helper, we will create the email with all these properties. And we will call that entire object as message. And then we have a variable created response where we will using our client, we will call the send email async method to send this message to the client or to the user. And finally, we will return the response, whether it's a success, whether it's a failure. So this is how the SendGrid email sending works. So you can always refer back to their website and look at this method. There's nothing difficult to understand this. It's very simple, and we all use emails daily, so we know how the procedure works, what are these values for, and what they actually mean. So the next thing that we want to do in the next video tutorial is we are going to create an interface, and this interface will be used to access this email. We can directly create an object of this class SendGrid email sender and access this method, but we don't want classes to directly access this class or this method. Instead, we will create an interface to access this class. This is called factory design pattern, where we use interfaces to access classes rather than directly accessing them. And we will create this interface in the next video tutorial to access our SendGrid email sender service so that we can use it in our classes, other classes, and also add it to the pipeline of our application inside these services. So for this video tutorial, this should be it. Please like and subscribe my channel Tech Howdy. If you have any questions and comments, please use the comment section.